right, so where we left off, part 2 of the development of standardized field sobriety testing and the fraud that was perpetrated by the researchers who compiled and created these tests that are widely used by police officers nowadays in drunk driving enforcement. So for 20 years, the NHTSA researchers told the public that these tests could accurately discriminate between a .08 and a .10. If you were an 09, presumably you would pass these tests. If you were an 07, you would pass these tests. If you were a 10 or an 11 or a 12, you would fail the tests. At least that's what they were trying to sell onto the public. And then, oops, the legal limit was lowered from .10 to .08. So where I left off in part 1 was I was asking, do you think that they created new tests? Do you think that they came up with new ways of scoring the old tests? And the answer is no. It was a complete clown show. The Southern California Research Institute took on the grant to validate the standardized field sobriety training course to the new 08 lower legal limit. They did not invent any new tests. They did not come up with a new scoring technique. Nothing was changed from the old standardized field sobriety tests that had been used since 1977. They continued to use the exact same tests and the exact same scoring methodology, saying, wow, well, our tests are even more accurate now that you lowered it down to 08. In other words, it was a lie for 20 years. What I want you to imagine is that if you were sitting on a jury back in, say, 1990, and the judge was reading instructions off to you as a juror in a drunk driving case after a police officer had testified, well, based upon the performance of the HGN test, it's 77% likely that the motorist, or the defendant in this case, is guilty of operating while intoxicated. It's 68% likely because he failed the walk and turn exhibiting 2 or more clues that he was over the .10 legal limit. And there were at least 2 clues in the one-leg stand, so it's 65% likely that the motorist was over the .10 legal limit when he was stopped and arrested. And let's say that there's no breath or blood. So based upon that, the jury would convict, because NHTSA had told us for 20 years that these tests could tell whether or not a person was at or above the legal limit. The fact of the matter is, a lot of people exhibit clues, 4 or more clues on the HGN at .10 and 08, because a lot of motorists and subjects exhibit clues of 4 or more clues on the HGN when they're in 05 or in 06 or in 04. And they'll exhibit clues even at a low BAC or a 0 BAC on the walk and turn and the one-leg stand. Nonetheless, the Southern California Research Institute put together 3 different studies: Colorado in 1995, Florida in 1997, and San Diego in 1998. The Colorado study established, I'll blow this up for you, that there was a 93% accuracy rate based upon the standardized field sobriety tests. The Florida study, conducted in 1997, established that there was a 95% accuracy if the 3-test battery was used. And the San Diego study in 1998 established a 91% accuracy rate. So given these numbers, what could us defense attorneys possibly do? We should just run home crying ourselves to sleep, right? 93% accurate in Colorado, 95% accurate in Florida, and 91% accurate in San Diego. With those numbers, we should tuck tail and run, right? Except that's not the whole story. In Florida, 18% of people below 08 had 5 or 6 HGN clues. And I've got the citation down there. If you want to pull the Florida study, it's available online. You can take a look at Table 4. Half of the people under 08 had 4 or more clues on the HGN test. The Florida study suggested that over 50% had at least 4 clues, but it doesn't come right out and say that. Instead, they try to conceal those numbers by suggesting that half of those that were correctly released had 0 or 2 clues. What about the other half? How many clues did those people have? You can read this in the actual study itself. So we know that people at low BACs were having 4 or more clues on the HGN. And in the Florida study, they acknowledged that 67% of all people who were incorrectly arrested had 6 or more clues on the HGN. And the walk and turn, 70% of the people under 08 showed 2 or more clues on the walk and turn in the Florida study. In the Colorado study, 1 in 8 people under 05 had 4 or more clues. Now, again, this was supposed to validate the new lower limit of 08, but yet we find a significant number of people with 4 or more clues at 05. And in San Diego, this is interesting because we see the dosing differential come back yet again from the 1981 study, where there was this dosing differential to establish whether or not the test could accurately discriminate at 0.10. It's no different here in 1998 in the San Diego study. The average BAC was a 0.15. And the same is true for Florida and Colorado. Florida, the average BAC was a 0.15. And in Colorado, the average BAC was a 0.152. Now, what is interesting about this is that nowadays many states charge super drunk at 0.15. In Michigan, you have to be a 0.17 or higher before the prosecutors are allowed to charge a high BAC driving offense, but many states consider 0.15 to be a high back offense, attaching additional penalties if you're a 0.15 or higher. In other words, a person who's a 15 or a 17 is clearly and unequivocally intoxicated compared to these borderline cases that we see down around 08, where a person can be easily confused with having no alcohol and an 08. The false arrests in the San Diego study were 6 times more common than the false negatives, where a person who was not arrested had a BAC of 0.08 or greater. This is in the San Diego study, page 18, figure 4. Again, you can look these numbers up. I'm not making it up. They're in the studies. And of course, the San Diego police officers who had this bold 91% accuracy were all equipped with preliminary breath testing units. So when you're using a PBT, it's not surprising that you're making an accurate arrest decision 91% of the time, and certainly it does not help validate your hokey standardized field sobriety test battery. And in Florida, what we find is that Florida, there is flawless performance of the field sobriety tests. No errors were observed in over 313 standardized field sobriety test batteries that were conducted. Only 2/3 of those tests, however, were actually monitored. And what's weirder still is that 1 out of every 7 investigations, a total of 53 investigations, the officers who were knowingly participating in the pilot study to validate standardized field sobriety tests decided, hey, we're just going to throw that out the window. We're not going to use the standardized field sobriety test battery in 1 out of 7 cases. And in Florida, we've got those who were wrongfully arrested had 5.2 clues on the HGN, 3.6 clues on the walk and turn, and 2 clues on the one-leg stand. And despite claiming proficiency and accuracy, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration failed to obtain chemical evidence, like breath or blood, in nearly 1 out of every 5 cases. 18% of the cases, they had no breath or blood. The Florida study gets even stranger. The strangest of all things, the gross number of false arrests in Florida is actually inexplicably small compared to the number of times that the officers used non-standard tests or had a chemical test refusal. And the chemical test refusals, of course, were counted as correct arrest decisions, even though we have no idea if the person was at or below the legal limit. And we also see a nearly flawless performance in Colorado. In Colorado, only 13 errors, 13 of the errors were found to be in administration, and 6 errors in instruction were observed out of 305 standardized field sobriety test battery administrations, with only 41% of those being observed. But compare this to a 2004 study by J.L. Booker, the Horizontal Gaze Nystagmus Test, Fraudulent Science in the American Courts. In that, Booker found, after reviewing hundreds of video recordings of police officers performing the horizontal gaze nystagmus, simply looking to see if they made the requisite number of passes, took the amount of time that they're supposed to, and held the stimulus at 12 to 15 inches away from the subject's face, he found and published in a peer-reviewed study that 95% of the administration of the HGN test was done not in conformity with the published methodologies. Anyway, so, they're finding so few flaws in Florida, so few flaws in Colorado, but yet Booker can pick up a whole bunch of videotapes, watch them, and say, yeah, they're not doing it right in any of these. Now, of course, that might have been the statistical exception, that maybe somehow he just found his way to all the good tapes. I don't know. Specificity. Let's talk about specificity for a moment. Specificity in statistics may be defined as the percentage of true negatives, i.e., those who are actually under 08 and who are correctly classified as such by the test. The data from the San Diego study shows that the field sobriety tests miserably fail when it comes to those with a BAC of 07 and 09. And that shouldn't surprise us. The ability to tell the difference between an 07 and an 09 using these tests, knowing now what we already know, that these things are flawed. It should not come as a surprise that these tests cannot adequately discriminate between an 07 and an 09. But what is specificity? Specificity in this instance was only 36% for those who were between 07 and 09. And this is a peer-reviewed research paper from Listala, who is an expert witness from Washington State, and Steve Oberman, who I know from the National College for DUI Defense. If you get a chance, I highly recommend reading this because it gets into the heavy-duty statistics, bringing out all that data from the San Diego study to make these, to do this statistical analysis. The rate was only slightly higher, 44% for those that were between 06 and 10. Now, this is where we're really starting to see that there's a problem, because if you can't tell an 06 from a 10, it's starting to become patently obvious that the field sobriety tests have very little specificity. And that rate increased to a whopping 55% for those that were between 05 and 10. Slightly better than a towing cost, And the fact of the matter is that the specificity rates are unacceptably poor in the San Diego study simply because it's difficult for these tests to discriminate between drinking drivers and drunk drivers. They can't tell. So what I advocate to defense attorneys is grill these officers on cross-examination, especially those officers that really want to focus on the statistics behind the field sobriety test. We're used to hearing from police officers the same old tired argument, the HGN test is 77% accurate. It's 88% accurate. That's misleading the jury. And when that happens, I advocate grilling these officers on cross-examination. Over 1 in 3 drivers under 08 had at least 4 HGN clues in the San Diego study. And you can see the citation down there below it. In the San Diego study, over 1/2 of those with a BAC under 08 had 2 or more clues on the walk and turn. On the one-leg stand in the San Diego study, over 40% of the people with a back under 08 had 2 or more clues on the one-leg stand. Again, these are all people who, based upon the test performance, should have been categorized as intoxicated, and in many instances were. Oh, but wait, there's Billy Mays. Billy Mays, and I'm Willie Mays. And Billy Mays says, oh, but wait, there's more. You have to actually sit down and read these studies. They contain a shocking amount of information. that shows over and over again an overt attempt at trying to hide the bad data. The courts, police, prosecutors, and the public believed this sales pitch, and tens of thousands of people were presumably either convinced to plead guilty because of their poor performance on the field sobriety test, or went to trial and were wrongfully convicted based upon these bogus field sobriety tests. Now, in 2007, the robustness of the Horizontal Gaze Nystagmus test was published by National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. This was, I believe, Dr. Burns' last foray into the standardized field sobriety tests. And this study is actually kind of funny. When I first started practicing drunk driving defense, I told you all at the beginning of part 1 that I took the standardized field sobriety training course in 2004. Well, in 2003, Dr. Burns had begun research on the HGN test because she complained that defense attorneys were using cross-examination on the administration of the test, claiming that the officers were doing it incorrectly, and courts, not all the courts in the United States, were willing to accept the HGN test. In many states, it still remains inadmissible. So she set out to prove the scientific validity of the HGN test and to prove that it didn't matter how you administered the test. And late one night in 2007, this office that I'm sitting in right here, it's probably around midnight, I was doing some research and preparing for a jury trial, and I found in the NHTSA materials that the study had been quietly released without anyone knowing about it. I immediately ran through some of the numbers and said, this isn't looking good, and I shot out an email to the National College for DUI Defense, and within days of that, a lot of the members from the National College for DUI Defense did a lot more detailed analysis of the numbers that had been released by Dr. Burns in the robustness study. What's even funnier, though, is that she personally attacked the National College for DUI Defense. She wrote in her publication, and this is a government publication, she wrote, quote, all that she could find in the online in computer searching was non-refereed DWI defense conference proceedings and newsletters on the Horizontal Gaze Nystagmus. And laughably, she also claimed that HGN serves as a diagnostic tool for emergency room physicians. Oh, Dr. Burns, there's no doctor or nurse out there using your fancy finger test. It's just not happening. After so many years, it's still only being used by police officers that are taking the training that you created. You created the stupid finger test. You're forcing officers to learn it, and you're teaching them that it's somehow valuable and accurate when we all know that it's not. I've got this funny cartoon here that I found. It says that the funny story, I ran some tests, and it turns out that random data is more accurate than our data. And good Lord, isn't that true? Burns has never been unbiased. She wrote in the robustness study, legal challenges to the standardized field sobriety test focus largely on questions of validity and reliability. More recent arguments have been that the tests should be inadmissible if the officer's administration on them varied from standardized procedures as set forth in the NHTSA ICP curriculum. And yeah, I mean, it was Dr. Burns and Herbert Moskowitz and Dr. Tharp that wrote in the materials that there was absolutely no flexibility to these tests. They're the ones who came up with this test. They made it up. They said there's no flexibility in how you administer it. And then Dr. Burns turns around and says, oh, you can do HGN however you want, gosh darn it. And this indicates here, the data demonstrates the validity of the HGN test with both standard and varied testing procedures. The variations did not alter the occurrence of or the observation of HGN. Yeah, Dr. Burns is living on a flat earth and fails to acknowledge the numbers that are right in front of her. Because as you tear through these numbers, going back all the way to the 1981 validation study where they were claiming 77% accuracy on the HGN test, we go through the robustness study and we find out that if a person is under 08, there is a 77% failure rate for people under 08. So 20 out of 26 subjects that were under 08 in the robustness study, and keep in mind, these are DREs conducting these tests. These are not young or inexperienced police officers. They found that there were 4 or more clues 77% of the time for people that were under 08. So how can you have a test that's 77% accurate and 77% inaccurate? So Burns, she bragged in the study that when the stimulus was moved closer to the face, when it was 10 inches as opposed to 12 to 15 inches, that the officers, they saw more clues. Well, they might have seen more clues. Doesn't mean that they were right, though. 22 out of 26 false positives were found at 12 to 15 inches. That increased to 24 out of 26 when the stimulus was held at 10 inches. And the false positive rate increased from 85% to 92%. A 92% error rate. I mean, that is an 8% success rate, right? Yay, we got 8%. Your kid comes home from school and you ask him how he did on the test. I got 8%, Dad. That's not a good score, son. And the study was delayed for 4 years with all of these errors in it. And nonetheless, Dr. Burns published it. And the only reason why I can figure is it gave something for the prosecutors to argue, of course, because she concluded that it was good science, of course. But I think that she had taken the grant to conduct this study, and she had to wrap it up after 4 years of delay in order to justify the fact that she'd taken all that money from the federal government. And to the best of my knowledge, again, this was her last foray into the standardized field sobriety test validation studies. So the variability of the HGN test, let me blow this up so you can see it a little bit more clearly. Analysis revealed that more than 40% of the variability in HGN observations was accounted for by significant differences between participants. If there's going to be a significant difference between the participants, how can this possibly be a valid test? The whole point to a valid test is that it applies uniformly to all of the participants. You can't say, hey, this group over here, they all got A's. Why? Because they do. They're entitled to A's. These folks over here, they get D's. Why do they get D's? They just do. Anyway, the Journal of the American Medical Association in August of 2023 published some remarkable findings that I believe destroy standardized field sobriety tests. This is a triple-blind study, meaning that the researchers, the officers, and the people who were compiling the scores, none of them knew what was being studied. It ultimately, all that data went over to other researchers who compiled it. Although if you actually read through the study, it does appear that triple blind wasn't as blind as we would like it to be. They used the walk and turn and the one-leg stand to determine whether or not THC-dosed patients or subjects would fail the walk and turn and one-leg stand, amongst some other ARIDE and DRE type tests. They eliminated HGN from it because one of the DREs said, oh, well, we wouldn't use HGN in a THC case because you would not expect to see nystagmus, meaning that it was not exactly a triple blind study. There was enough said there that they knew that they were looking for THC dosed. In any event, sober participants, this time they were tested and they were verified. So Dr. Burns can't come back and say, oh, well, this study was conducted next to the drug capital of the world or whatever, when the field sobriety tests are disastrous. 100% sober. We know that they're sober. We know that there's no alcohol and no controlled substances and no impairing substances on board. When they say that they're sober, they're 100% sober. Of those sober people, on the first pass, the first attempt to perform the walk and turn, which, as officers know, if you repeatedly do the walk and turn, it will lose its sensitivity because with practice comes perfection. But on that first try, 83.3% of the completely sober participants failed the walk and turn with 2 or more clues. 58.6% of sober participants failed the one-leg stand with 2 or more clues. And 50% of the sober participants failed both the walk and turn and the one-leg stand. I mean, that's not good when you've got a 50% failure rate for completely sober people. Now, you might say, hey, but they were trying to test for THC. Doesn't matter. I mean, you're going to do these tests on a roadside condition where you don't know if it's alcohol, THC, or any one of the other drug categories. I mean, the first step is using the standardized field sobriety test battery. And if 50% of completely sober motorists fail your walk and turn and your one-leg stand, that's disastrous. It goes on, though, and it also goes into the lack of convergence, finger to nose, and the modified Romberg, and it destroys these tests as well. When it came to the lack of convergence test, researchers were very pleased, like they were back in that Good and Osberger study, that there was this high rate of failure by people who were dosed. So they have THC dosed individuals, and 78.1% of the time, officers indicated that the subject could not cross his or her eyes. However, 77.4% of the time, completely sober subjects could not cross their eyes and also failed the lack of convergence test. Now, that sounds an awful lot like those early days of HGN where we had these huge failure rates for people who were under the legal limit, but these people aren't under a legal limit. These people are trip zeros. They're completely stone cold sober, and we're seeing that this huge number of people are failing the lack of convergence test even though they're completely sober. And it gets worse. The finger to nose, sober people actually did worse than the THC dosed people. So officers, I want you to imagine trying to use this finger to nose in connection with your A-ride, or you're a DRE and you've got some guy back at the police station and you're trying to say that this is good science. Look at these numbers. Incorrect sequence, 22.6% of completely sober people exhibited that portion of the test, as opposed to only 19.8% of the THC dosed. Now, 64 versus 65 for using pad rather than finger, I think that's pretty close to even Steven. But when we talk about leaving the finger on the nose, 22.6% versus 13.5% for the THC dose people is not inconsequential. That's a pretty large number or a large difference. 83.9% of the completely sober people had eyelid tremors, whereas 83.3% of the THC dosed had eyelid tremors. Now, all this said, I mean, the fact that the sober people were doing so much worse than or the equivalent of what the THC people were doing shows that just sober people fail this test. And it probably doesn't have any relationship whatsoever to these, whatever drug it might be, whether it's an impairing drug or THC or anything else. It looks to me like 83% of the population has, for example, eyelid tremors, right? But it gets worse in that the modified Romberg. In modified Romberg, the internal clock was unacceptable in 71% of the occasions when the motorist was when the subject was completely sober, versus 43.2% of the THC dosed people. So that's almost twice as many people that are completely sober are showing an internal clock that's unacceptable on the modified Romberg. And as you can see, I've highlighted the other numbers, but the bottom line is that the modified Romberg test and the finger to nose, they're useless. Lack of convergence is useless. Walk and turn and one leg stand are useless. These tests do not accurately predict whether or not a person is sober or intoxicated or somewhere in between. In fact, when it comes to modified Romberg, I think that if you fail the modified Romberg, it might stand as proof that you are actually sober because you failed it, right? And well, Your Honor, we're going to have to, we can justify our arrest because he passed the modified Romberg. will be our argument down the road, right? So this is a good time to take another break because this third part kind of gets into more legal arguments that I shared with defense attorneys on what to do with this information and how to get this information in before a court or in before a jury for argument's sake, and some issues that come up with the standard jury instructions. So I'll take a break at this point, and I guess we'll do a part 3, and I look forward to you joining me for that part 3, and thanks again for watching.